Consciousness is an instinct. If you are conscious of your visual field, your arms, your hand, your past memories, your spatial abilities.
It's that state of perceptive awareness that emerges as you wake from a deep sleep and which will continue during the day at greater or lesser intensity unless you go into a coma, you're knocked unconscious or you die.
Conscious of something means that you are aware of it and can tell people about it, can report it, and most likely have a memory of it later.
When I say I'm conscious, I might mean I'm awake, that I know where I am, that I know what I'm about to do, that I know what I've done in the past.
Consciousness is an inner state, an inner, if you like, an inner experience, an experience only you have.
What's consciousness? That's such a difficult question because within both science and philosophy there is no generally agreed definition of consciousness.
Of all the topics in psychological science, there is none more debated than consciousness. Informed by our senses, referenced by memory, locked inside each of us is that inner state that only we experience. But how it works is a great mystery.
Philosophers have wondered about this for 2,500 years. I mean, Plato and Aristotle have written about some of these questions. And what we have today, we know vastly more about consciousness. That unlike Aristotle, we don't think the heart has anything to do with it. We think it's the brain.
All of our so-called mental life is caused by neurobiological processes in the brain. There are as much biological processes as digestion or growth or the secretion of bile or mitosis or meiosis. Just we're talking straight biology here. And then the question is to try to figure out, well, in detail, how does it work? What brain processes are specifically responsible for consciousness?
We don't have great insight into how these billions and billions and billions of nerve cells are able to represent our experience, for example. We have no real understanding of how a physical system like the brain can give rise to subjective experience, to consciousness. So the so-called mind-brain problem, which has existed for millennia, for many of us, a question which we really struggle with. I cannot see how to answer this question, and people are divided on this.
There's one school of thought that thinks consciousness is a property of the entire brain. It's silly, it's a category mistake. So I come down on the side of people who say, well, probably they're very peculiar properties of a very peculiar set of neurons somewhere. They may be widely distributed throughout the brain, we don't know, that are responsible for this.
But if consciousness is not a property of the whole brain, does this imply we have a center for consciousness?
A center for consciousness. What does that mean exactly? It doesn't mean anything. It makes no logical sense whatsoever, because what's happening in this center? Moreover, we know from experiments that it's very, very unlikely, because then you would see some bright lit area shining while the person was awake. You give them anesthetic and it would be extinguished, and that doesn't happen. If you were to replace your neuronal circuits, module by module, with electronic ones, when would you cease to be you and become a zombie? My own view is that the brain doesn't work like that. As soon as you tamper with one thing, then holistically you change the whole system and organizations.
But this is an open research question, whether it's more the entire holistic brain that has to be considered, or whether there's certain elements that are much more important to study consciousness than other elements in the brain.
One thing most researchers do agree on is that consciousness involves a wide spectrum of awareness, from the most concentrated attention at one level to a total lack of consciousness at another.
Awareness is a property of consciousness, of conscious thought, and it disappears as we go towards the more unconscious end of things. Okay? With a sleep state or something like that being a perfect example of how we're simply not aware of our surroundings.
It's very tempting to think of attention as like a spotlight that sort of shines around the darkness and lights up one thing after another. And now I'm experiencing this, and now I'm looking over here and experiencing this.
But what about the elements the spotlight doesn't illuminate? What about the so-called unconscious?
99% of what we do is probably unconscious. As I'm sitting here talking to you, something's going on in my head, planning, hopefully, some form of the remark I'm going to make.
I hear these words come tumbling out of my mouth. It's not like I'm saying, okay, this is what I want to say. Okay, here's the verb, here's the adjective, here's the noun. Now it translates into English, in my case, and then I ship it out to my larynx. It just doesn't happen that way. I have a vague idea, and suddenly they're the words.
Or the classic example of the unconscious driving phenomenon, where you arrive at your destination and you think, how did I get here? I don't remember. I remember leaving home, and I don't remember that half-hour drive.
That doesn't mean that while you were driving, moment to moment, you weren't aware of the highway, of the cars, of everything going on around you. But you were not consciously monitoring the driving process or intending every step of the way to do what you did in terms of turning the wheel and moving your feet. That all sort of happened for you.
If you think of attention as the brain's resources, then in that case there has been a lot of resources paid to whatever you were thinking about or talking about, and a lot of resources paid to the driving. Was one of those in consciousness? Was kind of an extra light of consciousness shining on that one as well? I don't think the spotlight is a useful metaphor. I think it's a misleading metaphor.
These various properties of consciousness are not easily studied scientifically.
There is this element of subjectivity, which is an anathema to scientists, because if you say, well, there's something that someone feels that you can't measure or see, that nobody else feels, then clearly it's very hard to have purchase on that with experimental methodology.
To work around this subjectivity, researchers study the verifiable changes that occur when consciousness is altered by things such as hypnosis, psychoactive drugs, or brain surgery. Clues emerge, for example, by studying those who have had their brain hemispheres divided as a treatment for epilepsy, the so-called split brain patients.
Person goes in, has their brain divided, right? They wake up from surgery. They can talk out of their left brain, normally. They are no longer aware of anything to the left of where they're fixating. Now, you'd think you'd comment on that, right? Hey, doc, you know, I can't see half your face. Not a whisper, no sense of it at all. And it's as if the consciousness of that part of the visual field is locked into the right hemisphere. And so when it's now disconnected from the left doesn't have any question about it, because it's conscious of all the processes that he can talk about within the left hemisphere. And you come to the notion that consciousness is enabled locally by the system that you're talking about, wherever it is in the brain. And so by looking at it in that view, consciousness is viewed as a distributed system.
Researchers also look to the animal kingdom for evidence of consciousness. A lab rat's behavior makes it seem aware, but is it conscious?
We should really just weed out the thickets here a little bit. I think there's different types of consciousness. There's self-consciousness, and I certainly wouldn't think a rat looks at itself in the mirror and says, oh, I'm a rat. Probably not. Yeah. A small child doesn't do that either.
But many researchers argue that some animals do show evidence they are self-aware. Consider chimpanzees, for instance.
Gallup anaesthetised them, put a red mark on their forehead or on their ear, areas they couldn't see otherwise, and then showed them themselves in a mirror. And what the chimp did was look in the mirror and put his finger to the forehead where the mark was. He didn't put his finger on the red spot on the mirror, which would have been another chimp. So the essential basic notion is you cannot examine parts of your body with the aid of a mirror unless you know who you are.
What I can bring to the party as a neuroscientist is to actually challenge the idea that consciousness is all or none, you either have it or you don't, and suggest that instead what we should be looking for in the brain is something that can occur like a dimmer switch, if you like. I'm going to suggest that consciousness grows as brains grow. There is no Rubicon that you cross when suddenly, in anatomical or physiological terms, you can say this species is conscious, this one is not. I know Edelman, for example, Jerry Edelman, says the lobster isn't conscious. So that suggests he knows, or whoever claims animals are not conscious, they know where this line is that you cross. I suggest it's a continuum, and that the more sophisticated the brain, the deeper the consciousness.
When it comes to human consciousness, researchers agree that our alertness ebbs and flows along with other brain and body processes. That ebb and flow is a direct reflection of our circadian rhythms.
Circadian rhythms are 24-hour rhythms. In fact, the word circadian comes from the Greek for about a day, which is about 24 hours. And these are physiological rhythms or activity rhythms that fluctuate in sort of like a sine wave around the 24-hour period. So sleep-wake, for example, is a circadian rhythm. Core body temperature has a circadian rhythm. It drops at night, it rises in the morning, and then stays up for most of the day, except for the afternoon when it takes a little dip. So lots of our physiological systems have a circadian rhythm. Cortisol production, prolactin, all these things have circadian rhythms to them. The circadian rhythms help determine when you're going to be awake and when you're going to be asleep. Another thing that controls our sleep that's also part of our circadian rhythms is melatonin. Melatonin is a hormone that's produced in the pineal gland in the brain. Melatonin is secreted in darkness and is inhibited in light. So it also has the same 24-hour circadian rhythm. And as we secrete melatonin, that makes us sleepy, and that's part of what helps us sleep at night. What that means is it's very important that the sleep environment be very dark, because any light in the environment is going to inhibit melatonin production. It's going to tell the brain, it's time to get up. So it's important that we have lots of light during the day and lots of darkness at night. The light comes through the eyes, through the retinohypothalamic tract, to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the SCN, where our pacemaker resides. But we need a lot of bright light. The best source of bright light is, of course, the sun. And unfortunately, most of us spend our days in dark rooms not getting enough sunlight. Most of the time, we need about 2 hours or more of bright light exposure to have good, strong circadian rhythms.
People who must travel rapidly across time zones often find their circadian rhythms disrupted. A simple cure for jet lag, however, is sunlight.
So if you have someone who has a delayed sleep phase, that is, they're not ready to go to bed till the early morning hours, if you give them bright light exposure in the morning, that will advance their rhythm. That'll help them get sleepy earlier in the evening and wake up earlier in the morning.
Sleep and dream research is a part of the scientific study of consciousness. Why do I say that? Well, we lose consciousness when we go to sleep, and then we regain a different kind of consciousness within sleep. That's dreaming. And so if we want to start to make a map between the brain and the mind, we ought to look at those things carefully. Basically, we're offline in sleep. And there are a lot of things that are happening, however, even though consciousness is abandoned.
At the Gillen Laboratory of Sleep in San Diego, researchers like Dr. Sonia Ankali Israel are working to unlock the mysteries of sleep.
Many people think that sleep is a time when the body and the brain just shut down. But in fact, during sleep, both the body and the brain are very active. We define sleep by the physiological systems that we record, primarily our brain waves, our EEG.
You can fix the gain on respiration.
It's been a long day.
Looks like it's going to sleep nicely.
Yeah, I don't like that cannula.
It's the different frequencies and amplitudes of the EEG that tell us about the different stages of sleep. There are two states of sleep. One is called rapid eye movement, or REM sleep, and the other is called non-REM sleep. And non-REM is further broken down into 4 stages. Stage 1, 2, 3, and 4. Very complicated names. Stage 1 is the very lightest level of sleep. That's the point where you're just dozing off. You know you're not fully asleep yet, but you're not fully awake anymore either. That's the kind of sleep we do in dark lecture halls or at the symphony, places like that. And then stage 2 sleep is the next stage down, and each stage gets progressively deeper, with stages 3 and 4 being our very deepest levels of sleep. And they're sometimes called slow wave sleep, because if you look at the brain waves, the EEG, during these stages of sleep, you find that they are in fact very slow. The frequency is very slow, and the amplitude is very large. For most individuals, it takes about 90 minutes to get to the first dream period. From REM, they'll go back down to stage 2, back into the deeper levels, and they'll continue to cycle in and out of these different stages of sleep throughout the night. Most of the deep sleep, or stages 3 and 4, take place in the first third of the night, and most of our REM sleep takes place in the last third of the night, or in the morning hours.
Much like waking consciousness, the answers to how and why we sleep also remain a mystery.
We don't know exactly what the function of sleep is. Some of the theories include that it's very restorative. It's a time for the body to heal or to get ready again for the next day. Some of the theories have to do with thermoregulation, that it's a time for our systems to balance out, and particularly the temperature system.
It might be adaptive to shut off regions of the brain, or at least diminish their activity periodically, to allow new enzymes to be synthesized, enzymes that are antioxidants that will repair the damage that's been caused by the high metabolic rate. But you have many regions of the brain shut off. This primarily happens in non-REM sleep. So it's a way of repairing the brain.
Clues about the purpose of sleep emerge when we examine those who don't get enough of it.
As we grow into adulthood, most adults need around 8 hours. We run into problems when we don't get it. And sleep deprivation can have multiple consequences. The first is on performance.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that again, please?
It's much harder to perform optimally or even sufficiently if you haven't had a good night's sleep. Concentration is poor, attention is poor, memory is decreased. Sometimes insomnia is a primary sleep disorder, but more often than not, it's a complaint of difficulty sleeping that's caused by something else. And there are lots of things that could cause difficulty falling or staying asleep. Just about any medical condition that causes discomfort is going to cause difficulty sleeping at night. Many of the medications that people are used to taking have an activating side to them. They're stimulating, and so they actually make it harder to fall asleep at night. Depression is one of the most common causes of difficulty falling asleep. So it's important that these medical and psychiatric disorders be treated at the same time as the sleep complaint is being treated. It needs to be done hand in hand to try to improve the problem. There are actually studies that have shown that patients with insomnia who are not depressed are more likely to develop depression. Another very serious sleep disorder is sleep-disordered breathing, or sleep apnea. Clinically, people with this disorder may stop breathing hundreds of times during the night. Now, these awakenings are often very, very brief, so the patient may not even realize that they're waking up. The most common symptom of sleep apnea is loud snoring.
What will happen during sleep is the muscle relaxation will trigger a complete collapse of the airway, that the movement of the air will suck the two sides of the airway together and the airflow will just stop. Untreated sleep apnea over a period of time will produce cardiovascular changes, actual constriction of the blood vessels, much like you would get from increased cholesterol, and can lead to heart attack and stroke and so on.
There's a sleep disorder called narcolepsy, which is a disorder where the symptoms include being excessively sleepy and falling asleep. Pretty much any time they're sitting quietly, they might doze off. People with narcolepsy also have cataplexy. That's a condition where you have muscular weakness or paralysis, usually brought on by very strong emotions. So laughing very hard or getting angry or afraid might bring on this attack. They might fall to the ground in complete paralysis for a few minutes or longer. It is not a seizure. It's very different from a seizure. It's just a muscular weakness.
At the Sepulveda VA Medical Center in Los Angeles, Dr. Jerome Siegel and others conduct research on canines that have this unusual sleep disorder.
So there is a complete cataplectic attack. And so this animal is completely conscious, but has no muscle tone, and it will get up in a few seconds. And if this were a human, they would remember everything that's gone on. Before these animals were discovered, we knew almost nothing about narcolepsy. In fact, there were theories that it was a psychological illness.
Our group and a group at Stanford discovered that humans who have narcolepsy have a particular loss of one of these cell populations that control sleep, the hypocretin cell population. This is a group of cells in the hypothalamus. And it was found that most people diagnosed with narcolepsy have a nearly complete absence of this peptide. The hope is that now that we know that most narcolepsy is caused by the loss of this single neurotransmitter, hypocretin, we'll be able to replace that. This pathological condition gives us an opportunity to see what the neurochemistry is of loss of muscle tone with maintenance of consciousness, because normally they don't go together. And what we found in the narcoleptic dog is that in cataplexy, the norepinephrine neurons stop releasing norepinephrine just as they do in REM sleep.
Thus, the loss of muscle tone in narcolepsy is the same paralysis that happens when we dream.
During REM, our eyes move very rapidly. Everything else pretty much during REM is paralyzed.
Otherwise, we would get up and act out our dreams, and we don't do this. The clutch is out. The wheels are disconnected from the motor, but the motor is going through all of its programs. It's beautiful.
During REM sleep, our brain waves look very active. They actually look almost like the person is awake. And so sometimes REM sleep is also called paradoxical sleep.
It really is a paradox what REM sleep is for. We don't regulate body temperature in REM sleep. So if the room is cold, you'll get colder. If the room is hot, you'll get hotter. We all become like reptiles in REM sleep. We just drift towards room temperature. Of course, REM sleep doesn't last long enough for you to actually arrive at room temperature. But it's the only time when your thermoregulatory system isn't working. And so having REM sleep may have some significance for the function of the thermoregulatory system. Another idea about the function of REM sleep is that the stimulation of the brain is important in the development of the brain.
Newborn infants sleep 16 hours a day. They're getting 8 hours a day of REM sleep. And since REM sleep is an activated state of the brain, it's inescapable, I think, that REM sleep has something to do with the development of the brain.
It may be that REM sleep is part of the developmental process by maintaining this constant activation of sensory and motor systems. It promotes normal development.
Of all aspects of REM sleep, none is more fascinating than dreams. Experiences in the dream world range from the mundane to the absurd.
The content of dreams is just pretty weird and bizarre, and it jumps from scene to scene. And Freud and others have argued that there's deep significance to these dreams, that certain elements of a dream are symbols of deeper unconscious conflicts and wishes.
But today's neuroscientists focus less on dream interpretation and more on the physiology of REM sleep.
Our notion of the way that the brain is activated has changed beyond recognition. It proceeds from the brainstem up to the limbic system, and then it goes to the cortex, and the cortex is asked to make sense out of this stuff. The prefrontal cortex is deactivated during REM sleep when the rest of the brain is turned on. You can't think your way out of a paper bag. You can't remember. You're disoriented. So all of these cognitive functions are impaired. Emotion is strong. The limbic lobe is turned on. So, you have these very strong emotions. Dream emotions are very distinctive. Fear, anxiety, number 1. Elation, number 2. Anger, number 3. Somehow the brain is letting these emotions out, probably because those are very important emotions. Better be safe than sorry. You'd better defend your territory. Most of life is about wariness and defensiveness. And that's not defensiveness in the Freudian sense. It's defensiveness in the Darwinian sense, that it's very important to be anxious.
You ready for this test?
But how the brain concocts our particular dream images is debated. Some believe the cortex weaves a story from the chaotic mixture of signals from the lower brain.
Once you put anxiety into the brain mind, then you've got to associate to it. You've got to make a story out of it. What do if you're a busy urban human being? You imagine all your ducks are not in a row. You don't have the right clothes on. You're in the wrong place.
For all the research that's been done on dreaming, we still don't have an agreed-upon theory of why people dream. These theories are in competition with one another, and I rather suspect that a quarter century from now, we may have some agreed-upon understandings of why people dream, but as yet we have contesting ideas.
As with sleep, the hope is that science will solve the mystery of consciousness.
The greatest challenge to human ingenuity in the future is the elucidation of the basis of consciousness.
This is a great mystery for science. It's that difficult. And if you don't see the mystery, you haven't thought hard enough.
Maybe some quite new principle will come into it. I mean, something will emerge quite different in relation to the way we've thought about nature and the way we've thought about the biology of neuronal organisation. And it's exciting. I mean, somebody maybe will hit on it if that's the case. It may not be soon.
Inside Out is a 22-part series about psychology. For information on this program and accompanying materials, call 1-800-576-2988 or visit us online.